The words were a blade, and they severed the last thread of hope that had kept me tethered to the world. To my future bride, Viscount Sterling raised his glass, his smile a brilliant, cruel thing in the light of 1,000 candles, to the beautiful Rosamund. My sister, my radiant golden sister, blushed beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. For 4 years I had held on to the Viscount's quiet attentions, his shared books, his walks in the garden. I had mistaken his kindness for affection, his companionship for a silent courtship. I'd built a foolish, fragile castle in the air, and my stepmother had just handed him the torch to burn it to the ground. I felt the color drain from my face, a chilling emptiness rushing in to fill the void. The ballroom, moments before a glittering dream of music and light, became a cage. The whispers started around me, a rustle of silk and malice. They were not for Rosamund, the perfect bride, nor for the triumphant Viscount. They were for me. Elara, the plain, quiet sister, the fool who had waited. I could feel their eyes on me, not with pity, but with a kind of smug satisfaction. I was a cautionary tale whispered over champagne flutes, a ghost at the feast of my own heartbreak. My stepmother, Lady Beatrice, caught my eye from across the room. Her expression was one of perfectly feigned sympathy, a mask of concern that did not reach her cold, triumphant eyes. She had orchestrated this. Every shared glance with the Viscount, every book he had lent me, had likely been at her suggestion. A long, intricate game to keep me docile and hopeful while she secured the real prize, my sister, for a better match. I was the placeholder, the convenient companion, and now my purpose was served. My humiliation was the final flourish on her masterpiece of social climbing. I had to escape. My lungs felt tight, the air thick with perfume and mockery. Turning on my heel, I fled the grand ballroom, my movements clumsy and panicked. I did not head for the main exit, where I would be seen, but for a small curtained alcove near the musician's dais, a place I knew led to a disused stone balcony overlooking the less manicured part of the gardens. It was a place for shadows, for forgotten things. It was a place for me. I pushed through the heavy velvet, the fabric muffling the swell of the orchestra, and stumbled out into the cold night air. The sudden chill was a shock, but a welcome one. It felt real, honest, unlike the suffocating heat of the ballroom. I leaned against the cold stone balustrade, my fingers gripping the carved granite until my knuckles were white. I did not weep. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me, a glacier of grief too vast to thaw. I simply stared out into the darkness at the tangled shapes of overgrown rose bushes and the skeletal limbs of the winter trees. For years, I had cultivated a life of invisibility within my own home. I spoke when spoken to, I kept to my books on architecture and history, I made myself small to avoid my stepmother's sharp tongue and my father's weary sighs. I had believed that if I was quiet enough, unobtrusive enough, I would not be a burden. I had thought Viscount Sterling saw past that, saw something in me worth noticing. He had not. He had seen a convenient pastime until my beautiful sister came of age. The world had confirmed what my stepmother had been telling me for a decade. I was worthless. Plain, dull, and of no consequence, a living shadow, destined to fade into the background of other people's brighter lives. My own father stood beside Beatrice, beaming at his favored daughter, oblivious to the public execution of my heart. He loved me, I suppose, in his own passive, ineffectual way, but he loved peace more. And Beatrice was the gatekeeper of his peace. The Doric order is an interesting choice for a ballroom of this scale. It lends a certain severity, don't you think? Almost a contradiction to the frivolity it is meant to contain. The voice was low and deep, startlingly close. It held no pity, no condescension, only a calm, analytical tone. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. A man stood in the shadows of the doorway, a tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the light from the ballroom. He stepped forward, and the moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face. It was him. The Duke of Blackwood. Alistair, a man spoken of in hushed, intimidated tones throughout the county. He was impossibly wealthy, notoriously reclusive, and said to be as cold and unyielding as the granite of his ancestral home. He had not attended a social event in years, yet here he was on a forgotten balcony, speaking to me. I stared at him, unable to form a reply. Everyone in the ballroom had been vying for a single glance from this man. His unexpected arrival had sent a current of shock and excitement through the crowd. My stepmother had nearly vibrated with ambition, already plotting how to maneuver Rosamund into his path. And he had ignored them all, followed the invisible girl into her hiding place, and started a conversation about architectural columns. He did not seem to require an answer. His gaze lifted from my face to the carved frieze above our heads. Most would have opted for the more ornate Corinthian, a statement of wealth over substance, but Lord Ashworth's grandfather had a fondness for classical restraint, a rare quality. He looked back at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. They were not cold, as I had heard. They were still, like the surface of a deep, dark lake. He saw everything. I had the unnerving feeling that he had seen the entire sordid drama unfold in the ballroom. He had seen my flight, and he had understood it. I found my voice, though it was a mere whisper. I believe it was meant to evoke a sense of permanence, to suggest that the family's legacy is as enduring as a Greek temple. It was the sort of observation I would normally only make to myself, a thought from one of my books. A flicker of something, interest, perhaps surprise, crossed his features. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible. A legacy, he repeated, his voice thoughtful. An interesting concept. Legacies can be a foundation, or they can be a prison. He looked directly at me then, a piercing gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of quiet compliance I wore like a shroud. Which do you find this to be? The question was so direct, so personal, it left me breathless. No one ever asked for my opinion on anything more consequential than the choice of ribbon for a gown. He was not speaking about the architecture anymore. He was speaking about my life, my family, the gilded cage I inhabited. The honesty of the question demanded an honest answer. I have always found it cold, I admitted, my voice gaining a sliver of strength, and heavy, the weight of all that stone. The Duke of Blackwood held my gaze for a long moment. The sounds of the waltz drifted from the ballroom, a world away. On this balcony, there was only the cold night, the silent stone, and this man's unnerving, focused attention. He was the most powerful man in the room, perhaps in the entire region, and he had sought me out. Not to offer pity, not to mock, but to discuss architecture, to ask me what I thought, to see me. It was so unexpected, so utterly bizarre, that it shattered the numb despair that had encased my heart. For the first time all evening, I felt something other than pain. I felt a profound and terrifying confusion, and beneath it, a tiny, fragile spark of something I had not felt in years. Hope. He gave a single sharp nod as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. I agree, he said, his voice quiet but resonant. It is a place of immense weight. Without another word, he turned and melted back through the velvet curtains, leaving me alone in the moonlight, my world tilted on its axis. The Duke of Blackwood, a man who could have anyone, had chosen to speak to me. The whispers in the ballroom suddenly seemed very small, very distant. Something had shifted, a crack in the foundation of my miserable existence. In the days that followed, I existed in a state of suspended disbelief. My stepmother was furious, though she hid it beneath a veneer of saccharine concern. "My dear Elara," she'd said the morning after the ball, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I do hope you did not embarrass yourself with the Duke. He is not a man to be trifled with, and he must have thought it so odd finding you lurking on balconies. He was probably just being polite." She wanted me to believe it was nothing, a fleeting moment of pity. She wanted to shrink the event back down to a manageable size, to fit it into the narrative where I was a nobody. I tried to believe her. It was safer to believe her. Hope was a dangerous, jagged thing. I had been cut by it before, and the wound was still raw. I retreated to my books, to the familiar comfort of ink and parchment, trying to forget the intensity of the Duke's gaze, the unnerving way he had looked at me as if I were a person of substance. I tried to convince myself it was a fluke, a dream. Then the package arrived. It was delivered by a footman in the Blackwood livery, a crisp, dark green uniform that spoke of immense wealth and old power. It was a large, flat parcel, wrapped in simple brown paper, addressed to me. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was not a bouquet of flowers or a box of sweets, the typical gestures of courtship. It was a book, a magnificent leather-bound folio, its pages filled with exquisite architectural drawings by Palladio. It was a rare and priceless volume, something I had only ever read about. Tucked inside the cover was a single, thick card. On it, in strong black ink, was a simple sentence. I thought you might appreciate the substance over the ornamentation. It was signed, Alistair, Duke of Blackwood. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was not a fluke. He had remembered our conversation. He had understood it. He had understood me. This was not pity. This was a deliberate act of communication. A conversation continued from the balcony. My stepmother saw the book and her lips thinned into a bloodless line. How very peculiar, she remarked, her voice sharp, to send such a dusty, dull thing to a young lady. He must be even more eccentric than they say. But I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. This did not fit her plans. I did not fit. A week later, a formal invitation arrived. The Duke of Blackwood requested my presence along with my father's at his estate, Blackwood Manor, to view his collection of architectural treatises. It was a masterfully worded invitation, one that could not be refused without causing immense offense. It was also a direct and public challenge to my family's narrative about me. He was not inviting the beautiful Rosamund. He was not inviting my socially adept stepmother. He was inviting the plain, quiet girl who liked dusty books. My father, caught between his terror of his wife and his fear of offending a duke, simply wrung his hands and agreed. Beatrice was apoplectic. "It is a trick, a test of some sort," she hissed at me in the hallway, her fingers digging into my arm. "You will go there, you will say something stupid, and you will embarrass us all. Do you hear me, Elara? You are to be seen and not heard. Let your father do the talking." I merely nodded, my silence her only victory. But inside, something was hardening. The fear that had been my constant companion for years was being crowded out by a nascent sense of defiance. He had invited me. He wanted to hear what I had to say. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a tense, silent affair. My father stared grimly out the carriage window, no doubt rehearsing his pleasantries. I clutched the Palladio folio, which I was bringing to return, my knuckles white. As we passed through the great iron gates and the manor came into view, I gasped. It was not the foreboding Gothic fortress I had imagined. It was a marvel of Palladian symmetry and grace, a building that spoke not of gloomy power, but of intellect, order, and a profound understanding of light and space. It was a house that breathed. It was, quite simply, the most beautiful building I had ever seen. The Duke received us not in a grand, intimidating hall, but in his library. And what a library it was! It was 2 stories high, with soaring arched windows that flooded the room with afternoon light. Bookshelves stretched from the floor to the coffered ceiling, filled with thousands of volumes. A rolling ladder rested against one wall, and maps and architectural drawings were laid out on a vast central table. It was not a room for show. It was a room for work, for thought, for passion. It was the room I had dreamed of my entire life. "Miss Ashworth," the Duke said, his voice as calm and resonant as I remembered. He was dressed not in formal silks, but in a simple, well-cut woolen coat. He looked less like a duke and more like a scholar. "I am glad you could come." His eyes flickered to the book in my hands. "I trust you found it satisfactory." "It is magnificent, Your Grace," I managed, my voice steadier than I expected. "Thank you. I've brought it back." "It was a gift," he said simply, a quiet statement that left no room for argument. "It is yours." He then turned to my father, engaging him in a brief but polite conversation about estate matters, before steering me toward the large table. "I have something to show you," he said, his tone low, meant for me alone. He unrolled a large, crackling parchment. It was an original drawing, a preliminary sketch for the very house we were standing in. "My great-grandfather commissioned this design," he explained, his finger tracing one of the lines. "He was considered a radical. Everyone else was building mock castles. He wanted light, order, reason made manifest in stone." He looked at me, his expression serious. He believed a building could shape the character of the people who lived within it. "It has," I said before I could stop myself. The words just came out, a pure, unfiltered thought. This house, it is not severe. It is clear. It has integrity. The Duke's gaze sharpened. A long silence stretched between us, filled only with the scent of old paper and leather. My father shuffled his feet nervously in the background, but the Duke seemed to have forgotten he was there. Integrity, he repeated softly. He looked from the drawing to my face, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes beyond stillness and intellect. I saw a flicker of recognition, as if he had been searching for someone who spoke his own language and had, against all odds, found them. I was at a dinner party at your father's house some 5 years ago, he said, his voice dropping even lower. I rarely attended such things, but was obligated. I stepped into the garden for a moment of quiet. I overheard you speaking with one of the stonemasons who was repairing the garden wall. You were not much more than a girl. You were discussing the merits of a flying buttress versus a rib vault in supporting the old abbey ruins on the edge of the estate. You spoke of stress points and load-bearing walls. The stonemason was listening to you as an equal. My breath caught in my chest. I remembered that day. Old Thomas, the stonemason, was the only person who ever indulged my strange passion. I'd thought we were alone. I never forgot it, the Duke continued, his eyes holding mine. In a house full of trivial chatter about marriages and gowns, there was one person discussing how things of beauty and permanence are built, how they endure. He paused, the weight of his words settling in the air between us. That is why I invited you, Miss Ashworth. I find ornamentation tedious. I'm interested in foundations. In that moment, all my fear, all my stepmother's cruel whispers, all my lifelong insecurities crumbled into dust. He was not pitying me. He was not playing some inscrutable social game. He had seen me. Years ago, he had glimpsed the person I kept hidden from the world, and he had remembered. He valued the very things in me that my own family dismissed as strange and unladylike. He was not interested in the quiet, plain girl. He was interested in the mind that loved stone and order, the mind that understood foundations. For the first time, I felt the ground firm and solid beneath my feet. Our meetings became a quiet, steady rhythm in the weeks that followed. Always properly chaperoned by my increasingly bewildered father, they were nonetheless intensely private conversations. We moved from architecture to philosophy, from the history of empires to the theories of cartography. We would spend hours in his library, poring over ancient maps or debating the merits of Roman aqueducts versus Gothic cathedrals. With every conversation, I felt a part of myself, long dormant and suppressed, awaken and unfurl. My voice grew stronger, my opinions more confident. I was not just repeating things I had read in books, I was forming my own thoughts, and he listened to them with a focused gravity that made me feel like the most interesting person in the world. He, in turn, began to reveal parts of himself. The severe, reclusive Duke was a construct, a wall he had built around himself. The man behind it was possessed of a dry, understated wit and a deep, quiet well of feeling. He spoke of his lands not as a source of wealth, but as a responsibility. He knew the names of his tenant farmers, the struggles of the village weavers, the history of every crumbling wall and ancient oak on his property. He carried his power not as a crown, but as a heavy tool he was determined to wield justly. One rainy afternoon, as we examined the plans for a new bridge he intended to build over the River Rook, he fell silent. He stared at the elegant arch on the parchment, his expression clouded. "My brother wanted to be an architect," he said suddenly, his voice rough with an old, unhealed grief. "He drew this. It was one of his last designs before—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Everyone knew the story of the previous Duke's heir, a vibrant young man killed in a riding accident a decade earlier. It was after that tragedy that Alistair, the second son, had inherited the title and retreated from the world. He was the one with the vision, Alistair continued, his gaze distant. He saw the world in lines and forms, in light and shadow. I was just the spare, the practical one, meant for the army. He finally looked at me, and his carefully constructed composure cracked. For a moment, I saw the raw pain he kept so fiercely guarded. When I listen to you speak about the sweep of a roofline or the honesty of a well-laid stone, I hear him. You have the same clarity, the same passion. My heart ached for him, for the lonely weight of the legacy he carried. Instinctively, I reached out and laid my hand over his on the drawing. It was a shocking breach of decorum, a touch far too intimate for our acquaintance. His hand was warm and strong beneath mine. He flinched, not in rejection, but in surprise, as if he had forgotten what simple human contact felt like. He did not pull away. Instead, he slowly turned his hand over and curled his fingers around mine. His touch was hesitant at first, then firm, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm of grief he had just allowed me to glimpse. We stood like that for a long time, my small hand engulfed in his, the only sound the drumming of the rain against the tall library windows. The air between us was charged, thick with unspoken things. The lines of propriety had blurred and vanished. This was no longer about a shared intellectual interest. It was something deeper, a meeting of two solitary souls who had, by some miracle, found a point of connection. A near smile, the first I had ever seen from him, touched the corner of his mouth. It was a small, sad, beautiful thing, and it transformed his severe face completely. In that moment, looking at him, I knew with a terrifying certainty that I was falling in love. And the terror was not because I thought my feelings were unrequited. It was because, for the first time, I suspected they were not. The news of our continued association spread through the county like wildfire. It was a source of endless gossip and speculation. For my stepmother, it was a source of escalating fury. My burgeoning confidence was a direct threat to her authority. The Duke's public and sustained interest in me undermined the social hierarchy she had so carefully constructed within our family, a hierarchy that placed me firmly at the bottom. She had planned to marry Rosamund to a title, securing her own position for years to come. The Duke was the ultimate prize, and he was slipping through her fingers, drawn to the one person she had deemed utterly worthless. Her attacks grew more frequent, her words sharper, laced with a venom she no longer bothered to conceal. "You are making a fool of yourself, Elara," she would hiss when we were alone. "He is toying with you, a man of his stature, interested in a plain little bookworm like you. It is preposterous. He's amusing himself with an oddity, and when he is bored, he will cast you aside, and you will be a laughingstock." I tried to ignore her, to hold on to the quiet certainty I felt when I was with Alistair. But years of conditioning are a powerful thing. Her words were like acid, eating away at the fragile foundations of my newfound self-worth. Doubt began to creep in. What if she was right? What if this was all some elaborate, cruel game? One afternoon, I returned from a walk to find my room in disarray. My books were pulled from the shelves, my few personal treasures scattered. And on my writing desk, a letter was being penned by my stepmother. She did not see me in the doorway. I watched as her pen flew across the page, her handwriting a vicious, slanting script. It was a letter to the Duke. I could only read snippets from where I stood, but the words I saw made my blood run cold. A fragile, nervous disposition, prone to flights of fancy. Her obsession with you is a symptom of a deeper instability. For her own good, you must cease all contact. She was painting me as a mentally unhinged creature, a desperate spinster who had latched onto him with a pathetic, delusional obsession. It was a lie so vile, so perfectly calculated to prey on the prejudices of the time, that it might just work. She was trying to poison his mind, to destroy the one good thing that had ever happened to me. She looked up then and saw me. There was no shame in her eyes, only a cold, hard glare of defiance. "This is for your own good," she said, her voice chillingly calm. "You are not equipped for that world. I am protecting you from a fall that would destroy you." "You are not protecting me," I whispered, my voice trembling with a rage I had never known I possessed. "You are trying to bury me." "You were buried long ago, my dear," she replied, folding the letter with a crisp final movement. "I'm merely shoveling the dirt back on." She sealed the letter with a drop of wax, stamped it with the family crest, and swept past me out of the room, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my small sanctuary. The battle had been declared. She had launched her attack, and I felt a wave of helpless despair wash over me. How could I fight a lie like that? How could my quiet truth stand against her practiced, poisonous deceit? The days that followed were an agony of silence. I heard nothing from the Duke. The footman with the Blackwood livery did not appear at our door. The invitation ceased. My stepmother watched me with a smug, knowing look, her victory all but declared. The fragile hope that had bloomed within me began to wither. She had been right. He had believed her. He had read her vile words and seen me as she had painted me, a pathetic, unstable creature. He had cast me aside. The pain was 1,000 times worse than the Viscount's betrayal. This was not the loss of a foolish dream. This was the loss of my very self, the self he had helped me discover. I retreated into my shell, the silence of my room becoming a tomb once more. I had been given a glimpse of the sun, only to be plunged back into a deeper, colder darkness. Nearly a fortnight had passed, a stretch of time that felt like a barren eternity. I had resigned myself to the bitter truth. My stepmother had won. Then an official summons arrived. Not an invitation, but a summons. The Duke of Blackwood requested the presence of my father, Lord Ashworth, my stepmother, Lady Beatrice, my sister Rosamund, and myself at his manor the following day. The language was cold, formal, and utterly uncompromising. It was not a request that could be ignored. Panic seized my stepmother. "What is this? What does he want?" she demanded, her composure finally cracking. "What did you say to him?" She rounded on me, her eyes wild with suspicion. "I have said nothing," I replied, my voice a dull monotone. "I have not seen him or heard from him since the day you wrote your letter." Her face paled. The summons, she realized, was a direct consequence of her actions, but she could not discern its meaning. Was it a formal dismissal? A public denouncement? The uncertainty terrified her, and for the first time, I saw that her power was built on a foundation of fear. We arrived at Blackwood Manor the next afternoon. We were not shown to the library this time, but to the Duke's formal drawing room, a grand, imposing space I had never seen before. It was designed to intimidate, with its dark wood paneling, severe portraits of his ancestors, and a vast, cold marble fireplace. Alistair was standing by that fireplace, his back to us, staring into the empty hearth. He turned as we were announced, and my heart stopped. The warmth and intellectual curiosity I had come to know were gone. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes like chips of flint. He looked every inch the formidable, unapproachable Duke of his reputation. He did not offer us seats. He let us stand in the center of the room like supplicants. My father fidgeted. Beatrice plastered a nervous smile on her face, and Rosamund looked on in confusion. I simply stood still, bracing myself for the final blow. "I received a letter some days ago," the Duke began, his voice dangerously quiet, yet it filled the vast room. "An anonymous letter from a concerned party regarding Miss Elara Ashworth." He held up the single sheet of paper, my stepmother's letter. It made some very serious claims about her mental state, her stability. It painted a picture of a desperate, manipulative woman. Beatrice gave a small, theatrical gasp. "Oh, Your Grace, how dreadful! I cannot imagine who would write such a wicked thing." Alistair's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward. "No, I can. It was written on Ashworth stationery. The seal was the Ashworth family crest, and the handwriting, I have discovered after a brief consultation with your stationer, is a perfect match for yours, Lady Beatrice." The blood drained from my stepmother's face. The nervous smile froze, then crumbled. I was concerned for her," she stammered, her voice losing its polished edge. "She has always been delicate. I feared you were taking advantage of her innocence." "You feared," the Duke said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "that you were losing control. You feared that a person you had systematically devalued for years was about to escape her cage and, in doing so, eclipse your own ambitions." He took another step, and my stepmother flinched back. "So you did what all cowards do. You attacked her character with lies because you knew you could not attack her intellect." He then turned his gaze on my father. "And you, Lord Ashworth, you stood by for years and allowed this to happen. You allowed your eldest daughter to be treated like a servant in her own home, to be starved of affection and encouragement, all for the sake of a quiet life." My father flushed a deep mottled red and stared at the floor, shamefaced and silent. Alistair was not finished. He walked to a large desk and picked up a sheaf of legal documents. "My inquiries into this matter led me to some interesting discoveries. specifically regarding the dowry left to Elara by her mother, the First Lady Ashworth, a considerable sum, which was to be held in trust by you, her father, and managed for her benefit until her marriage. He looked at Beatrice, his expression one of utter contempt. It seems that for the past 10 years, the trust has been systematically plundered. Bad investments, extravagant household expenses, gowns and jewels for a new wife and a favored daughter. The money is almost entirely gone. A collective gasp filled the room. Rosamund looked at her mother in horror. My father looked as if he might faint. Beatrice stared at the Duke, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. "You have no right," she shrieked, her voice now a desperate hissing thing. "Those are private family matters." "Fraud is not a family matter, madam. It is a crime," the Duke stated, his voice like ice. "And you, Lord Ashworth, are complicit through your gross negligence. You allowed this woman to steal your daughter's inheritance from under your very nose." All this time, I had been silent, a spectator at the dismantling of my life's tormentors. The shock was so profound, it was like being struck by lightning. He had not believed her letter for a single second. He had seen the lie for what it was, and instead of dismissing me, he had launched an investigation. He had used his immense power not to punish me, but to protect me, to unearth a truth I never even knew existed. He looked at me then, and the cold fury in his eyes softened, replaced by a deep, unwavering concern. It was that look that finally broke my silence. The years of suppressed pain, of swallowed insults, of quiet endurance rose up in me like a flood. I found my voice, and it was not the hesitant whisper of the girl on the balcony. It was clear and strong and trembling with the force of a decade of injustice. I took a step forward, directly in front of my stepmother. "It was never about the money," I said, my voice ringing with a strength I did not know I possessed. "The money is just paper. You stole my life. You stole my confidence. You taught me day after day that I was worthless. You made me believe that my mind was a flaw, that my passions were an embarrassment. You tried to make me invisible, a ghost in my own home, because my very existence was an inconvenient reminder of the woman you replaced." I turned to my father. "And you let her. You chose her comfort over your own daughter's happiness. You saw her cruelty, and you looked away." I faced my stepmother again. "But you failed," I said, and the truth of the words resonated deep in my soul. "You could not crush the part of me that mattered. You could not silence the thoughts in my head. You could not stop me from seeing the beauty in a well-turned arch or the strength in an honest foundation. You tried to bury me, but you did not realize I was a seed." Tears were streaming down my face now, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of catharsis, of liberation. Rosamund was weeping openly, her illusions about her mother shattered. My father could not meet my eyes. And Beatrice stared at me, her face contorted with pure, undiluted hatred. She had been so utterly, so publicly defeated. The Duke had not just exposed her, he had given me the stage to reclaim my own story. He had empowered me to save myself. "You will repay every last shilling," the Duke said to my father and stepmother, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "I will see to it personally. And you, Lady Beatrice, will find that society is remarkably cold to thieves and slanderers. Your climbing is over." He then looked at me, his gaze gentle. "Elara, it is finished." And in that moment, I knew he was right. The long, dark chapter of my life was finally, blessedly over. The silence that descended after my father, stepmother, and a sobbing Rosamund departed was profound. It was not an empty silence, but one filled with the weight of all that had been said, all that had been broken and remade. The great intimidating drawing room no longer felt cold. It felt like a sanctuary, a place of vindication. I stood by the window, looking out at the manicured lawns of Blackwood Manor, my hands still trembling from the force of my confrontation. I had spoken the truth, my truth, for the first time in my life, and I felt scoured clean, raw but whole. Alistair came to stand beside me. He did not speak for a long time, simply stood near enough that I could feel the warmth and solidarity radiating from him. He gave me the space to breathe, to absorb the magnitude of the shift that had just occurred. The power dynamic of my entire existence had been irrevocably overturned. I was no longer the victim. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, his voice gentle, stripped of the ducal authority he had wielded so devastatingly just moments before. I turned to face him, my eyes meeting his. "I think for the first time in a very long time, I am," I said, and my voice was steady. I offered him a watery but genuine smile. "Thank you for believing me." "There was never any question of believing you, Elara," he said, his expression serious, his gaze intense. "The letter was an act of desperation. It held the shrill tone of a lie. Your voice has always held the quiet resonance of truth." He reached out, his gesture hesitant, and gently brushed a stray tear from my cheek with his thumb. The touch was electric, a spark of impossible tenderness in the wake of such brutal emotional warfare. "I'm sorry you had to endure that," he continued, his hand dropping away, though the warmth of it lingered on my skin. "I could have handled it privately, but I knew you needed to face them. You needed to speak. It was not my place to rescue you." His words struck me with their profound wisdom and respect. He had not seen me as a damsel in distress to be saved. He had seen me as a woman of strength who needed the right ground on which to fight her own battle. He had not rescued me. He had armed me. He had given me the truth, and in doing so, had given me back my own voice. "You did not rescue me, Alistair," I said, using his first name without thinking, the sound of it natural and right on my tongue. "You saw me, and that was more than enough." We stood in the fading afternoon light, the space between us charged with a deep and unspoken understanding. The intellectual connection we had forged over books and drawings had been tempered in the fire of this confrontation, becoming something stronger, more resilient, more real. It was a bond of mutual respect, of shared values, of two minds that saw the world with the same clarity. "Elara," he said, his voice low and earnest, pulling me from my thoughts. "When I first retreated to this house after my brother's death, I built walls around myself, just as surely as my ancestors built the walls around this estate. I believed I would spend my life alone with my books and my duties. I found the world to be a place of ornamentation and triviality, and I wanted no part of it." He took a step closer, his dark eyes searching my face. "And then I heard a young woman in a garden, speaking of foundations. I saw a woman on a balcony who looked at a ballroom and saw not the glitter, but the weight of the stone. You see the truth of things, the structure beneath the facade. You do not just see buildings, Elara, you see people." My heart was beating a frantic, hopeful rhythm against my ribs. I could barely breathe. "I have no interest in rescuing you from your family," he said, his voice growing thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "I am asking you to rescue me from my solitude. I am asking you to be my partner, to argue with me about architectural plans, to manage these estates with me, to build a life with me, to be the foundation of my home." He took my hands in his grip firm and sure. "Elara Ashworth, will you marry me?" The tears I thought were spent returned, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This was not a proposal born of pity or duty. It was a proposal of partnership, a meeting of equals. He was asking for my mind, my passion, my strength, the very things I had been taught to hide. He was not offering me a title or a fortune. He was offering me a life where I would be finally and completely seen. "Yes," I breathed, the word a sigh of profound relief and happiness. "Yes, Alistair, I will." A slow, radiant smile spread across his face, the genuine, unguarded smile I had only glimpsed once before. It was like watching the sun rise over his stern, handsome features. He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles. Then, framing my face with his hands, he leaned down and kissed me. It was not a hesitant, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of arrival. It was deep and sure, and tasted of promises kept in a future I had never dared to imagine. It was the end of a very long, very cold winter, and the beginning of everything. 1 year later, the autumn sunlight, low and golden, streamed through the tall arched windows of the library at Blackwood Manor. My library now, our library. It illuminated the swirling dust motes and fell warmly across the vast table where Alistair and I sat, our heads bent close together over a set of architectural drawings. The scent of old leather and wood smoke from the crackling fire filled the air, a perfume of contentment and peace. "If we reinforce this load-bearing wall here," I said, tracing a line on the parchment with my finger, "we can open up this entire north-facing wall for a series of glass panels. It would flood the new schoolhouse with natural light." Alistair leaned in, his shoulder pressing against mine, his gaze following my finger. "An excellent thought," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. My brother would have approved. He always said light was the most crucial building material. He looked from the plans to me, a soft, familiar smile playing on his lips. "You have brought more light into this house than I ever thought possible, Elara." I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder for a moment, my heart swelling with a quiet, powerful joy. My life now was almost unrecognizable from the one I had left behind. My father, humbled and remorseful, had begun the long process of repaying my stolen inheritance, his letters to me filled with a regret he had never been able to voice in person. Rosamund, having cut ties with her disgraced mother, had found a surprising strength and independence. Our sisterly bond was, for the first time, genuine. As for Beatrice, she had vanished from society, living in a forced, impoverished exile, her name a cautionary tale whispered in the very drawing rooms she had fought so desperately to conquer. But they were ghosts, figures from a past that no longer had the power to haunt me. My present, my future, was here, in this room, with this man. Our marriage was a true partnership. We managed the estate together, our days filled with purpose and shared passion. My voice was not only heard, but sought. My opinions were not just tolerated, but valued. Alistair had not given me my worth. He had simply been the one to hold up a mirror and show me the worth that had been there all along. He reached across the table and picked up the beautiful Palladio folio he had given me what felt like a lifetime ago. He opened it to a random page, his fingers gently skimming the intricate drawing of a Venetian villa. "Do you remember what you said?" he asked softly. "On the balcony that night, you spoke of permanence, of a legacy built of stone." I smiled, the memory clear and sharp, a turning point upon which my entire world had pivoted. "I do." He closed the book and took my hand, his thumb stroking the simple gold band on my finger. "This," he said, his eyes meeting mine, his gaze filled with a love so deep and steady it was my anchor in the world. "This is the only legacy that matters, not one of stone or title, but one of being truly known, of being seen." And in the warm, quiet light of our library, surrounded by the foundations of history and the blueprints of our future, I knew he was right. I was no longer the invisible girl, the shadow in the corner. I was Elara, Duchess of Blackwood. I was a wife, a partner, an architect of my own life. I was home, and I was finally completely seen.